So from a reporting standpoint, if I really break it down from a simplified perspective, one option is to create a centralized analytics team. So, we traditionally have our standard departments that have been around for decades, whether it's accounting, finance, marketing, sales, customer service, being able to create a truly new department that's not embedded underneath anything else, but reports directly to that CEO, to the leader, and creating that centralized analytics team. This can be really helpful for organizations that are sending the message of how important analytics is to their future. It can also really strengthen the budgetary and visibility that team starts to have when they're producing output for the rest of the organization. So that centralized model can really work for some organizations in order to jumpstart it.
Is there a preference? Again, I think the bigger the companies go, the more that they probably want that centralized model. But that may not be the case, right? I guess it depends on the personality of the folks. And is there a preference dynamically one way or the other?
Some experts would say that centralized is the way to go, that you're not fully mature in your analytics development unless you have a centralized team. I would beg to differ a little bit. There's also benefits to the next structure that we'll go to, which is decentralized. But I do believe that centralized can be very beneficial depending on where you're at. So again, if you need to add visibility to it, if you need to gain some traction, and if you have a need to have cross-functional projects. So we tend to get siloed in our organizations, and so as that analytics capability matures, there's oftentimes a need for someone to look at it from an enterprise level, to say, how do we actually develop projects that benefit us as an entire company, and not just in marketing, not just in customer service, not just in operations, but combining all that together, and that centralized team can play that role as well.
Sure, that makes sense.
So the other structure that is an option is to be more decentralized, or another term that's oftentimes used is federated. And so this would be having analytics teams embedded in departments that already exist. So within your marketing department, within your IT department, you have an analytics team. So that means there are multiple teams throughout the organization. The federated part comes from an operating structure separate from the org structure or reporting hierarchy that says we as analytics leaders are all going to get together in some type of format, whether it's forming an enterprise leadership council or some type of connection for our recruiting efforts, but that although we report separately, we operate as an analytics function holistically. This method or structure can also include a centralized analytics team that's smaller, but the bulk of the analytics talent is reporting up through the operations, through the respective functions.
So this, in my mind, would be for a pretty large organization if they're going to break down their teams to this level, unless the teams are pretty small. But typically, and I know you'll discuss this as we go, you have to have a certain amount of people for sure to have a true team put together.
Yeah, so one way that this structure could be modified over time is you could start with a decentralized structure with having one analytics team underneath one function, and the team's 3 to 5 people. So that's how you get started down this path. And then as you get going, you might add another team under another function and another team under another function. So it doesn't have to start with 100 people. It could start with 2 people, and you call it our analytics team that happens to report up to IT or happens to report up to marketing. And then as your analytics capability continues to grow, you just continue to add to the existing teams or add more teams in different functions across the company.
Got it.
So those are 2 models for how to organize your analytics team. Let's just talk a little bit about that decentralized model, and if you have the hub of your analytics reporting to different leaders, how it impacts the focus that they'll have. So if an organization says we are going to have a centralized analytics team, but we want them to report up to the IT space, to our chief information officer, our chief technology officer, my bias, perhaps, is just to note that analytics team may lean more towards the data and the tools that it takes in order to make analytics happen, because that's kind of the expertise that department typically brings to the organization. So they're also going to apply that to analytics, making sure that the business intelligence tools that are being used, the data science tools that are being used, and the data structure is ready for analytics and really top-notch. If I contrast that, if you will, some organizations choose to have their analytics team report up to the CFO, the accounting finance function. Oftentimes what I see is those analytics leaders are very much focused on the ROI. So there's a lot more scrutiny on the projects that they're working on because the project has to have a defined ROI. What are you getting for the investment of all these people we have doing analytics? Another option that a lot of organizations choose is to have their analytics report up to their chief operating officer, more of their operations group. Those analytics teams oftentimes focus on productivity, reducing cost, localizing the analytics. Self-service analytics happens sooner. So the flavor and the strategy of the analytics team just changes depending on where they report to. A couple other examples of this, analytics reporting to a chief marketing officer is going to focus more on how do we use analytics to gain more customers, gain more sales. This is oftentimes a place that organizations start with when they're building out their analytics team for the first time because there's almost always opportunity to analyze more when it comes to customer and sales. And then from that HR and analytics standpoint, an analytics team reporting up to a chief HR officer would focus on engagement and that talent analytics, and then the chief analytics officer is really focused on strategy if they're really reporting up to that CEO.